so everybody should have the slide deck up on their screen. We'll go ahead and get started. This is our third module of the series called Flight Operations. This may be the longest session yet because there's a lot of detail in flight operations. So bear with me and be patient and enjoy yourselves. Okay, I do have a few requests. Click the mute on your screen if you're not already muted. Of course, if you're going to talk, you can unclick the mute while you're talking, but that will keep our audio channel a lot clearer. Please type a chat with your name and email address in it. We probably have most of you, but this is a good way to have a roster of who attended. And Dave Buchwald, I'm going to take a note for myself that you attended last week's meeting as well. I was trying to figure out who that was. So make sure your screen name is correct. And I'm going to stop the share for a moment. Let's have everybody raise their hand. There's a screen icon where you can raise your hand. And see if everybody can get those hands up. The idea of doing this, of course, is that you may have a need to ask a question at some point, and if you can put your hand up, that's an easy way to. Del Blodgett is both putting her hand up and giving a hand. So I'm not talking about the applause one, just the raising the hand. But when you raise your hand, I only have the ability to see 3 people at a time on my screen, but anybody with a hand up is going to pop up for me so I can see them. And Edward Story, okay, now you can all unraise your hands. And I'll get the share going again. Okay, so good enough. So Dale and Sai, if you can remove your hands. And then if you really do have a question, feel free to put your hand back up. I see Del Blodgett is in the meeting now. She had a question last week that I wasn't able to address during the meeting, so I'll just address it right here. Her question was, do we sign MOUs with our counties, and how many of our DARTs are doing this? We've had a bunch of them look at it. To date, the WEACT group, the Watsonville Emergency Airlift Command Team, has come closest to it, although they're on the outs with their county at the moment because of staff changeover. We don't charge for our service, and I think that is a big driver of having an MOU. You know, how does the money get spent and who authorizes it? What seems to work pretty well is that they know that we're an organization that is active in disaster and markets our services to the general public and various organizations. Hopefully we get to know the people in the county well so that if we need their help getting through checkpoints or something during a disaster, they'll speak up for us and authorize our group to operate. But so far, no, we haven't had MOUs. I know if you have an annual exercise, it's a good idea to invite the county to come and observe, and that way they feel comfortable with how the whole process works, and they'll invite you into their EOC as a preferred provider when you need help. So that's Dale's question. Moving on. So tonight we're going to cover the DART process flowchart, what happens in a DART and how flight operations works into that process. We're going to look at function descriptions for flight operations. And again, this is function based as opposed to job title based. The training that we're doing tonight is training on the function. We're going to look at the forms, which is, of course, the driest part of all, and it comes at the very end where you'll be a little bit tired, but hopefully you'll still have some staying power and get through that with me. And we'll also look at how flight operations interfaces with other parts of a given DART, as well as interfacing with other DARTs if there's multiple DARTs simultaneously active. So here's our wonderful Marion Harris stick diagram of a DART operation. Starts off with people in customer service receiving phone calls or maybe amateur radio calls, inquiring about help and taking some of their information. If we're active at the airport, people are coming through the airport fence, checking in at the gate that we advise them to come in at, and we get them registered. They sign a waiver if they're going to fly in an airplane or be a volunteer or be a pilot. If they have stuff to ship, we weigh it, bag it, tag it. And all this first process was customer service. Now we're beginning to get into the flight operations. When flight operations has all that passenger intake and service request intake complete, now they hand the job off to flight operations. Flight operations starts worrying about what planes they have. Have they taken in enough pilots on the pilot intake process? What planes and pilots match the given payload and the place that we're trying to go to? They start assigning pilots to operations. Pretty soon the pilots are getting into their plane with their loads. In fact, maybe that's the plane arriving at the airport. And now we've got our different cargo going to different airports piled up. We use a little help from ramp operations to load it in a wagon, take it out to the plane. Here we have a flagman helping the pilot taxi into parking or depart. And of course, we don't always have flagman. That's a pretty ritzy service if we've got that. And then the pilots go off and make their delivery. Also, at the very end of the day, we want to make sure those pilots get home safe and sound. And by the way, if you're new coming into the meeting, please put your name in the chat and your email address so that we know you attended. So I mentioned that flight operations is a function. If you're lucky and you've got a lot of people, you may have dedicated staff that has the title flight operations in their badge. Or it may be that you've got people wearing a lot of hats, and flight operations is just one of the things they're doing. It doesn't really matter as long as we get the job done. So what is the function of flight operations? Here's a real high level look at it before we get into some of the nitty-gritty details. We want to make sure that our pilots are documented. We're putting the general public up in the air with pilots. Pilots are known to tell tall tales and fly planes when they're not certificated. Some pilots have been found to be unworthy of insurance and are maybe hazardous in our operations. We prefer not to have them involved with us. And so we do check out a fair amount of pilot documentation. Once we've got our pilots and once customer service have given us the requests, we arrange the flights. Once we arrange the flights, we introduce the pilots to the people they interface. Now, who do they interface? That could be passengers out on the ramp that are going to fly in their plane and go someplace. Very likely, it's also people at the other end, because it's going to be a relatively rare case that we have a DART working at the other end and we can just say report to the DART at the ramp. But whether it's the DART they report to, or whether it's an FBO that they're going to drop something off at, or maybe drop their passengers off at a known FBO, maybe it's a local person that's going to show up at the airport with a pickup truck, and we're going to give them that person's cell phone to make sure they get connected when they arrive. We're introducing them to the people the pilots will need to interface. Marielle, go ahead, ask your question. And you'll need to unmute, of course.
Yes, my question is, what if there is no one at the other end? What if it's somebody who just says, I need to get to this other place, and there's nobody at the other end?
Well, the pilot would do well to at least get them to an airport gate where they can get out of the airport. They're probably going with a cell phone and they can call their friend. Presumably they have a reason they're going there and they're going to connect with somebody when they get there.
So my question is, do we insist that there be somebody at the other end?
No, we don't.
Okay.
If there's not going to be somebody at the other end, we might want to talk to that passenger so that they understand what they're getting into. Bob Goodwin, go ahead.
Yes, I strongly prefer that we at least have some communication with the airport, the arriving airport. If there's not at least a ham radio link or telephone communication, I would just not send a pilot there.
Well, if the airport's in service, it's just like going to any airport in the nation. And we had a lot of experience with this in COVID operations, where we would go to an airport, and normally there is some kind of a drop-off arrangement to where it's dropping off with an FBO, or the person's going to meet us there with a pickup truck or something. But if it's a disaster and we don't know that the airport's at service, then certainly we don't dispatch a pilot if we don't know that they can land there. Is that what you were thinking, Bob, that maybe the airport isn't even in service?
That's right.
Yeah, not to be taken for granted if there's a huge earthquake over a long area, right? Yeah, okay, good point. Okay, so,
Before you go on, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do they have to have an official reason to use our services to get someplace, or they just want to go someplace and that's okay? Don't they have to have some kind of official permission or reason or something like that for us to take them somewhere?
okay, so when we're deciding whether or not we're going to mobilize, we're reaching out to our partners and asking what kind of needs they see for service. So we may get some authorized, very good requests right then and there. Once we activate for service, we're open, and it becomes kind of a triage thing. You try to get the most important operations done first, but if you've got the pilots and the capacity, anybody could want to go anywhere. Okay, and now some of you have arrived late. Be sure to put your names in the chat with your email address. And if you want to ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand. It'll pop up on my screen and I can let you in at a good point. Okay, so getting back to Wayne Roten, go ahead.
Yeah, concerning that last question, who sets the priorities? Is that just kind of a group consensus, or is it the incident commander, or what?
Well, it's the DART, and the DART, of course, is the DART incident commander leading it. And so he sets the policy and the tone. But then depending on how big that DART is, he may not be involved with every single, or she may not be involved with every single request for service. So that then boils down to customer service figuring out, which of the requests are the most important ones.
Yeah, I can see a lot of competing directions on that. Some people say medical is the highest importance for this particular incident. Other people will say something else, and then after the high priority ones, then there's different low priority ones, and somebody's low priority is higher than somebody else's low priority. So I can see a lot of room for disagreement. Maybe that could be part of an MOU. Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind also that we serve at the function of emergency services, and in a disaster, emergency services runs the show, starting with the county and the operational area and devolving down to the city level. So if they have urgent priorities, those should get right near the very top of your DART's priority list. And it's possible your DART will even get commandeered. The state could possibly do that. It's not likely, but it's possible. Dale, go ahead. Dale,
okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe you've covered this, but how does one get to be the DART incident commander? In the FEMA CERT world, it's all volunteers, and whoever shows up first is in charge until someone else takes over. Is that the model with DART as well?
Yeah, on our disaster airlift response plan, every DART has a core group of people that help that DART stay in business. And that group of people is supposed to reach out to each other after the onset of a disaster and figure out who's best positioned to be the DART incident commander, and they become the DART incident commander, and then they run with it. So that's our method of choosing a DART incident commander.
Okay, that sounds a lot better for an aviation world instead of just haphazard who shows up first.
Well, there's a certain practicality to that. It may be that someone should be the incident commander, but they're not at the airport. And maybe it takes them 8 hours to get to the airport. So you may want to offer service and not wait for 8 hours to get started. So that principle of whoever's there first serves until they can be relieved by someone of better capability, that's a valid principle.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, even if it is a little haphazard. Okay, we do have about 40 slides to get through. 45 maybe. So hopefully we can keep the thing moving forward. We're getting back to the flight operations function from a macro forest level. The fourth step here is to inform customer service of completions. So if you're using internet documentation, you may be able to mark right on their documentation that the job is complete. Otherwise, customer service may say, no, that's our document. We want you to tell us. Be sure to tell them in any case that the service is completed, and they may be the ones to mark it off. And one very important thing at the end there, make sure your pilots get home. You know, you can have a lot of different pilots participating in a disaster. Our record so far is 23. It could be hundreds or even 1,000 or more if we had a really big disaster. Try to organize yourself so that you can check and make sure each of those pilots get home, and that you can help them out if they aren't home and they need some support. So how to prepare yourselves to work in flight ops. All of you are here because you are interested in this function. That's wonderful. Attending this class is a good thing. We have a disaster airlift response plan. It's good to read it and go back and reread it and refer to it from time to time to learn it and absorb it and really understand what it's getting at. It's not perfect. It's got a lot of issues with it, but it's way, way better than nothing. And it does represent the sum total of what we've learned in the first 10 years or so we've been doing this. Learn the forms that are the documentation of how we do an operation. As the operations get bigger and more complex, there's a lot of information that's available on those forms that really helps us avoid becoming irresponsible at some point because we are not able to respond to a question or an inquiry, or we're not able to deal with something that didn't complete right. So those forms really give us a lot of backup. You can watch this training video. Participation in annual exercises is good. That keeps your capabilities up, and it also puts the rubber to the road, because it's one thing to think about it theoretically. It's a whole nother thing to actually see people at the airport and put them into planes and get them to fly. And one last little thing, we have a lot of people who aren't pilots help us out in DART, and there's a whole lot of things you can do. Flight operations is one area where it's very, very helpful to be a pilot. And so if you can get one or two or a few experienced pilots in the backbone of the flight operations, that can really help the overall operational safety, as well as making the plans a lot more suitable and executable. So flight ops staff characteristics. How can you be the best flight ops staff, or what should you be looking for in people you're looking for flight ops? Having a good command of the DARP is helpful. If you've got people that don't have an idea of what's going on with it, you're going to, as a manager, like a DART incident commander, you're going to have to spend your whole time with them, helping them do what they need to do. So ideally, you get people who can work independently, and they can do that if they have good command of the DART. You want people that can apply information from the training courses they've experienced. I mentioned earlier that an experienced, capable pilot is good, because there's a whole lot about aviation that we're not even bothering to try to teach in the DART, and you learn that by being a pilot and by having hours in the system. It's good if you can be a mentor, especially if you move into management, help train other people to do the job. Good listening skills is important. A lot of times accidents happen because people aren't listening very well. So listen what the passenger's saying, listen what the pilots are saying, listen to what briefers are saying, do that and put it all together and cogitate on it. We want to be ensured that the job is being done right and safely by subordinates. So we're only as good as our ability to execute. We have a wide range of experience in the people who are helping us, and we want to help each other do the job right. Don't ever let somebody be on their own on an island that doesn't have a lot of experience, that doesn't really understand what they're doing, and then have them not get any support. Make sure everybody gets the support they need. And being a little bit flexible. Sometimes it's written up in the DART a certain way. We've not yet gotten it right in the DART, and I don't think we ever will. Sometimes the situation recalls for something to be done differently than the way it's done in the DART. So in the flight operations staff, if you see a problem and it's not working well,
and can imagine a better way to do it. And if you can bring your Dart incident commander into it, because of course the Dart incident commander is the person who has authority to authorize a deviation from a given procedure. But that's helpful to have people that can envision a better way to do things. And finally, experience is helpful. So the extent you've done actual mobilizations and participated, that's a wonderful thing. So who performs flight operations functions? I mentioned that it's a function and it's not a job title, but we have org charts. The org charts have job titles. So let's get into some of those people who might have to do it. Well, your Dart incident commander in level 4 and 3 mobilizations can do it. And I'll show the org charts in a minute. So let's not get too tied up on this right here. Your flight operations manager in levels 1, 3, 2, and 1 mobilizations could be doing it. Your flight operations staff in level 2 and 1, where you've got a big enough operation that you've got staff. And an operations section chief could be doing it in a level 1 mobilization. So let's look at the picture on that and see how that comes out. So here's your level 4, your very simplest mobilization. You've got one ground person, and that's the Dart incident commander. And who knows, maybe 1 to 10 pilots working with them. So Dart incident commander is doing all the functions. He's doing customer service, he's doing flight operations, volunteer recruitment, you name it. He's got the whole thing. Level 3 operation, we've got a Dart incident commander. So, and he's got a flight operations manager, but only, we call this person a flight operations manager. But what if that person, this is the first operation they've ever been in? And what if they've never read the Dart? Well, certainly your Dart incident commander is likely to be getting involved a lot in flight operations and helping make sure that it works out okay. Now, to some extent, you can even get pilots involved. Like on an aircraft load sheet, that's a flight operations form. You could delegate that to a pilot to fill out and save you a lot of time if you're short of staff in a flight operations area. Now, if you delegate it to a pilot, you still have to make sure that they've done the job right, but it still can save you a lot of paperwork time. So I'll just throw out a question and people will be ready to raise your hand if you want to try to answer it. What happens if the flight operation manager has to fly? And we've actually got a couple of these happening in San Martin next weekend. So who wants to take a crack at that? Who does flight operations if you don't have a flight operations department? This would be, say, a level 3 mobilization. Anybody want to give it a try?
I'll try. Maybe I think the responsibility would go up to the Dart incident commander.
Yep, Dart incident commander could do it, and probably he's going to try to push it right back down. Maybe customer service or something like that. And then we also show here a recruitment manager. This is one of the last functions to get staffed typically, and maybe you don't have a recruitment manager. So does somebody want to try to answer what would you do if there is no recruitment manager? Okay, not seeing a hand, not hearing a voice. I'll just throw it
Well,
out
I'll
there.
take a crack. Everybody's in charge of recruiting when it's an all hands on deck.
Yeah, and everybody can recruit. So Colette, that's a wonderful answer. Of course, any job that doesn't get done is the Dart incident commander's responsibility. But
Yeah.
having people like Colette that want to jump in and help out, that's wonderful. It's everybody's job to recruit. Okay, good enough. We'll move on.
Isn't the answer, Paul, that we call you?
Yeah, I've been task saturated before. You don't want to have people in task saturation. They do a bad job when they're saturated. Okay, so
Well, I have a question about that. If you could go back one slide, is it possible for one of the other operations managers or customer service managers to take over the responsibility of someone who's not there, like the recruitment or flight operations manager?
Yep, it's absolutely possible because all of these DART functions are just that, they're functions. And it's up to the DART incident commander to clearly explain who's picking up what function. And we do have some ready-made job descriptions. And if you're lucky enough that you can just, do it exactly the way the DART is laid out, then that's easiest. But life is never easy, and reality intrudes. So you got to figure out, how do I get it done when I don't have it staffed exactly the way the DART would have it. Okay, so level 2 DART mobilization. Now we've got managers and all these different functions. We've got some staff. So hopefully, as you get into a bigger area, you've got a really experienced person as the ramp or as the flight operations manager, and stuff will stop with them. So the flight operations staff will get counseled by the flight operations manager, and 99% of it will get done there. But on the other hand, there may be some issues that do boil up to the DART incident commander because they're just complex, or they get into kind of a strategic strategy sort of thinking where you want to get that level involved. But most of it hopefully will stay at this level. Now here's the level 1 DART mobilization where you've got a really big incident going. The DART incident commander at this point really can't get involved with the details. The different segments of the organization have to deal with their own details. The operations section chief is hopefully where the buck stops. If we had a disaster big enough to require this sort of an operation, I'm hoping that we would get several DARTs that would all join together and provide staff, because typically one DART is not this deep where they could fill up this kind of an org chart and really do it all themselves. But that operations section chief would get involved, the flight ops manager would get involved, and the staff of flight ops, all of them would be doing flight ops functions. So you get to the airport, you're in flight operations, what do? First thing is you sign a volunteer waiver of liability form. And if you're lucky, you've got a recruitment manager that's hounding you and telling you to do this. If you're not lucky, it may be that an overworked DART incident commander isn't reminding you. So you can help out by saying, hey, where are the volunteer waiver of liabilities? I got to sign one of those. You can make sure that you have a DART uniform on, which is your white shirt, black or dark blue pants, and a DART vest. And we do need to get some vests out to Livermore and to Grass Valley. And then the last thing you do, start setting up the flight operations area. So we looked at a diagram last week where somebody had a building that they could use, and they were basically figuring out, how do I optimize this existing building to be used as a DART operations center? Here's another way to look at it. You could have a portable shelter. This is one of those portable garages, about 18 by 20 feet. And you can have a very simple working area inside of it. Customer service and flight operations in the front can be a good idea, because that's where the pilots are coming to be given jobs, and that's where the public's coming to get their stuff dropped off, or their passenger status set up. Now, there's some external things to think about when you're setting up flight operations. How do you do that? So you could coordinate with the airport director. If you've got a big operation going, the airport director should know that there's a DART active on the field. You might want to let the FAA, especially air traffic control, need to know, as there may be TFRs and restrictions going on during a disaster, and you want to let them know that you're active. We have a Form 220A, that gets filled out to tell the California Air Coordination Group that your DART is active. I'm going to stop the share for just a second. Let's see a show of just raising your hand. Who here has already sent in a Form 220 to the California Air Coordination Group as a part of their experience in CalDART? Anybody? Am I the only one? Okay, I see Marielle has done it. I see Bob has done it. This is a standard part of all of our exercises. Once a year, we want each DART to send the California Air Coordination Group, which is staffed out of the Caltrans Department of Aviation, Department of Aeronautics, as well as Cal OES. And they've got they're basically help the state of California get its fingerprint on air operations during disasters. So the FAA is in charge of writing TFRs, but the FAA sits inside the California Business Center, which gets activated when there's a disaster, and the California Air Coordination Group person is going to be right next to the FAA, and they may be writing TFRs that would affect our ability to use the airspace. So, the DART incident commander typically is going to be working with them, but it affects us in flight ops, and that we have to make sure that outwardly that we can use the airspace in the airports. And of course, if you got a towered airport, you want to advise the tower that you're working, and they may possibly have special procedures they want you to use. Could be taxi restrictions, could be terminology, who knows. You want to investigate the airspace. So that's doing a normal flight briefing, as well as going out to these agencies I mentioned. Now, if the TFR is affecting your area where you want to operate, TFRs will always have a person in charge of the TFR. You can work that TFR from several angles. You can work it from the angle of calling the phone number on the TFR and saying, hey, we're a DART, we need to work into this airport. That's your preferred way to go, because that's the person who's primarily managing that airspace. The FAA has given them the use of the airspace, but generally they will try to work you in if they can. Now, if they don't let you in, that's where we use our contacts in the California Air Coordination Group and the FAA to see if we can get written into that TFR as well. So that's TFRs. Next up, contacting CalDART headquarters or staff. So if we really do have issues with the airspace and you feel like you're having trouble dealing with it on your own, don't hesitate to reach out to me and to CalDART headquarters in general. We might be able to provide you some assistance with contacts we have at a state level and an FAA level. So that's investigating the airspace before you actually go operational.
Paul, can I interrupt a moment? Could
Sure.
you start sharing your screen again? You haven't gone back to that.
Well, good point. Thank you, Dale.
Somebody else raised their hand. I didn't know.
That's okay. I imagine Bob Goodwin, that's probably what you were about to tell me too. So raise your hand again if you wanted to add anything else to the conversation. Okay, so let me show these other. So I missed this slide, give you a quick look at it. Missed this one, investigating the airspace. This is doing a normal brief where you get to see what's going on in the airspace. And this one, now we're going to talk about flight ops internally. So looking inward to the operation, what do we have to do? So you got to prepare a work area, find some desks or tables, chairs, forms. Hopefully you've got a cache of forms at your airport if you're a DART, so you can just pull them out of the file drawer and get them going. Hopefully you've got binders set up ahead of time with all the forms you're going to need. And reference DARPs. So DARPs are the Disaster Airlift Response Plan. Hopefully you've got a few of those sitting around your flight operations area so that anybody who's staff, if they need to look something up, they can refer to it real quickly. Certainly it's very hard to memorize the DARP, and it's nice to be able to use it as a reference. So next you want to train workers on how to fill out forms and assign flights. And this is an important part. We don't really go operational in our DART until each of the little functions is up and running. And when you haven't thought about DART in a year and suddenly you're on a team, your mind has to go through a little bit of a transition to be ready to provide service. So that's rereading the DART. There's a little cheat sheet showing what flight operations has to do. That's having everybody that's in the operation remember and showing them what the forms are and how all the boxes in the forms get filled out and why we need them, what we use them for, that sort of thing. It could be that as you're getting ready to provide service, you say, oh my God, look at, there's all these people and we don't have pilots and we don't have staff. So escalate your needs for staff to the DART incident commander and your volunteer recruitment manager if needed. So once everybody's trained up and ready to go, now you're ready to tell your DART incident commander, hey, flight operations is good. You can get started. And now, even after you're started, as people come through, especially if you've got new people on the job, it's a good thing for an experienced person to kind of sit nearby and review people's work and help make sure that there's nothing that they're missing.
So now pilot intake. It's pretty important, very important. I referred to this a little bit at the beginning of this session tonight. That we make sure that all of our pilots are ready to go. Dale, if you could mute, that would be helpful. We're picking up a little bit of sound coming through your microphone. So let me see here for a second.
4 big commercial size fire extinguishers.
Okay, good enough.
Those things that
Diane, if you could, never mind, I got it for you. Diane, I muted you there, so we were picking up some noise off your microphone. You can unmute if you're ready to talk at some point.
Okay.
So pilot recruitment. If you're lucky, volunteer recruitment is going to be available and able to assist you with your pilot recruitment. A lot of times we don't have a volunteer recruiter, and so it falls on the shoulders of flight operations to do their own recruitment. And even if you have volunteer recruitment in the particular job of pilot intake, they may not do it right. So someone in flight operations has to do a quality check on the pilot intake if somebody else has done it to make sure they really checked all the documents, the medical, the pilot certificate, the aircraft and information form, that it's all together. So pilots need to be CalDART members. An exception there is if they're Angel Flight West pilots who are procured according to our memorandum of understanding. And the documentation that the pilot needs to present, pilot certificate, the medical basis could be a basic med or class 1, 2, or 3. Their aircraft liability insurance, we're looking for minimum $1 million and 100K, and a government issued photo ID. And then finally, sometimes this stuff gets stored online, or maybe it gets submitted online, like people send in an email with scans of all this stuff. If they do that, make sure that you've got the information stored confidentially and not up on a public server or something like that. So how to get more pilots and staff? Your local DART incident commander can put out a request to the CalDART members and friends list. All of our DART incident commanders have access to that information. The DART incident commander can submit a request to Angels Flight West. And you can also ask CalDART to submit a request to the West Coast General Aviation Response Plan. And these are pilots that go up into the states of Washington, Oregon, Canada, Idaho. Generally, we're not going to do that unless it's a really, really big disaster. But if we're wanting hundreds of planes to report and we've got many days to work it, that's indeed something we might do. Dave, go ahead.
Do the Angel Flight West pilots come in with a badge or credential, or do these fill out the forms like everyone else?
Great setup question. I think that's my next slide.
Okay.
Angel Flight West, MOU, how does that work? Okay, so it's a very specific procedure we go through. Angel Flight West may provide some pilots upon an official DART request, and that's through the DART incident commander. They may do it, they may not. They may be busy, they may need a reminder. It may be that you can reach out to me and I can help prod them a little bit for you. But I do know that Angel Flight West has been a very, very helpful supporter in at least 2 of our mobilizations. So they provided about 7 or 8 pilots for the Oregon Firefighter Airlift, and another 4 or 5 turned out to be dual members of both CalDART and Angel Flight West. And in the exercise we're having on the 24th, they're supplying 6 pilots, which are very gladly accepted. So we accept Angel Flight West's pilot intake procedures in lieu of CalDART pilot intake procedures. So if they are referred from Angel Flight West, we're not asking for the insurance. We're not asking for the pilot certificate and the medical. And if they're referred by Angel Flight West, we don't require them to be a CalDART member before they can fly. Now, it's important that we made the request and Angel Flight West headquarters staff provided the pilots. And of course, they're providing the pilots by advertising it via their own email, and they have their own reservation system.
and then they get back to us saying who responded. So if a pilot just walks up, and I think, Dave, this gets to your question, hey, I'm an Angel Flight pilot, I want to participate. The answer is, well, no, you didn't get referred to by the Angel Flight headquarters. And so, no, you need to go through the pilot intake. Now, if you're in a jam for a lot of pilots, it's a real benefit from a labor point of view to take an Angel Flight West pilot, because it takes a fair amount of labor, both for the pilot and for flight operations, to check all this documentation. So there's certainly some expediency to having Angel Flight West pilots involved. So the person you address the request to at Angel Flight is Sherry Simarusti. That's her email address. And copy me, because I have found her to be very helpful, but needing a reminder here and there. Provide the date and time of your operation, the number of pilots you need, and the operation description. And hopefully the operation description is uplifting and exciting, because pilots are human. They want to participate in something that catches their eye and sounds like, wow, that's important. I want to help out with that. Of course, you don't want to oversell it, but you want to describe it truthfully as well as you can and as interestingly as you can. Now, once you have an Angel Flight pilot, Angel Flight has released them to our DART. So now they are under the direction of the flight operations. So flight operations, if you're having an annual exercise and you're flying for 4 hours on a Saturday, they show up and you assign them a flight and give them passengers or whatever you're doing, and go tell them to go fly. And then you still make sure they get home okay when everything's done. Okay, any questions about the Angel Flight West MOU? A great setup question, Dave. Okay, next up. So preparing the pilots. Number one, thank them for their service. And this goes for everybody in the whole DART. All of us are there. We have other things to do with our time. For a lot of people, participating in a disaster preparedness exercise would not be their original way of thinking that they were going to have fun on a Saturday. So thank everybody for helping out. Then you'll want to be sure that you brief the pilots with information regarding the DART operations, and check with them and ask them if they've had a chance to do their own pre-briefing before they've come. You may need to fill them in on some things if they haven't. Or you may need to tell them, we'll go get a briefing and then come back to me when your briefing is done. And of course, they may not truly be able to do their briefing until you tell them where you want them to fly. When you prepare those pilots and speak with them and review their information, you can have a short conversation with them, which gives you a picture in your mind of what kind of operation can this pilot accept and be happy with and perform safely. Because all pilots have different what do we call them? Limitations, minimums, my private minimums. I make sure we give them something that's going to be comfortable within the way they like to fly. And if you have any notes that you want to put for yourself and for your team, go ahead and put them right on the pilot aircraft information form, as well as a pilot list. And that can help you make sure that you make that final assignment properly. And make sure the pilots know that they should refuse a flight if they cannot complete this flight safely. It may be that there's been a disconnect somewhere, and somewhere along the line somebody thought something was there, but it's not. So if the pilot's the one that needs to pull the plug, we'll pull it. If they've been given a load that doesn't meet requirements, can't fly, or I can fly with a modified load, or any other reason that they feel they shouldn't fly. Maybe they've got crazy passengers that are going to grab the yoke and make the plane go into the ground. Make sure they know they can that they should refuse the flight if they don't feel they can complete it safely for any reason. And then remind your pilots to use IFR and VFR flight following, one or the other, so that we can monitor their progress on FlightAware or other programs of that nature. Diane, go ahead.
Paul, what exactly does a load that doesn't meet requirements mean? Too heavy for the plane, or too big, or I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, well, it could be that there's been a miscommunication as to what the assignable weight is. It may be that the pilot was saying, well, I was including my own weight with the assignable weight, and that detail gets overlooked until, he has to load the load. It could be that you've given him his maximum weight worth of face masks. And if you've ever looked at face masks, they take up a lot of room. Maybe only half of it's going to actually fit in the plane. So there can be reasons why the load doesn't fit. Okay. And moving on. So flight planning tools. It's a nice thing, pilot lounge, when you go to an FBO, if you can recreate that pilot lounge for your pilots, a computer with access to the internet, with access to flight briefings, that's godsend. Of course, a lot of people are doing it on their smartphones these days, but helpful if you have some of these tools available. And of course, if you have a current airport and facilities directory, maybe not many of us are using it, but it does have useful information in it, and that's valid to have in your pilot area. And then there may be information associated with the disaster that affects their ability to fly. And so any information like that ideally is up on a big whiteboard on a tripod, so very plainly in sight, so all pilots can see it and know that this airport only has 2,000 usable feet on the runway, or whatever the information is that people should know. Now, in documenting and dispatching flights. So we want to develop and prioritize the missions based on service request forms. So when I say develop, customer service already gave us a very neat operation tied off with a bow. Why do I need to develop it? Well, it turns out we're delivering to an airport that doesn't have a DART. And, how's that pilot going to drop it off? Is it going to be at an FBO? Is it going to be with a person? What's that person's phone number? So there may still be some work to do with that particular pilot to complete figuring out how to make this flight. Then you want to match the pilots to the cargo and passengers and flight difficulty, and all prioritized as to importance. And of course, hopefully, customer service has given you guidance on which flights are most important. But it may be that a very important flight isn't really feasible in terms of some flight difficulty. So maybe there's some other flight that's going to be done instead. You could complete, or you will complete, an aircraft load sheet for each flight, recording each flight on the airlift dispatch log. So these are analogous to the customer service request and the customer service request log. The log is very easy to find a given flight out of a bunch of flights. And the aircraft load sheet has all the details associated with that particular flight. Then we update our shipping receiving log, cargo labels, customer service request form, and passenger tickets with the aircraft load number assigned to that load. So it may be that flight operations is walking out to the passenger and writing in the number of their flight on their passenger ticket as they introduce the pilot to them. It may be that you're contacting customer service and saying, hey, this service requisition is going out on this flight number, and customer service is updating their own documentation. Then be sure that your passengers have been screened for medical considerations and brief pilots on them. And so pilots, as part of your intake of those pilots in your initial briefing, you should be telling them, go take a quick read on section 2.05 in the DART. And that has information that pilots should be thinking about anytime they put a person in disaster in their plane. There's some danger signs you can look for that maybe that person isn't really in shape to fly. Then, of course, decline passengers if for some reason it doesn't look like they can fly for some reason to that screening. So Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, real quick, Paul. So for the loading, is there a common practice for pilots to take cargo and passengers, or is it pretty much best practice to just stick to one or the other at the same time?
There's some expediency there. If you've got passengers and cargo going to a single airport, you might combine them. The loading can be a little bit more challenging. I'll talk about it in a later slide, but it's possible to load and to actually put the aircraft load sheet together out on the ramp itself, to where the pilot's there, he's loading the plane, and you really know that what you documented on the form can go on the plane.
Great.
Is good enough. Diane, you have a question?
Yes, on number 2, match pilots to cargo, I'd like to suggest that you add something about distance and fuel capacity and weight limits there as well.
Yeah, certainly the weight limits are a big thing. There's a pilot and aircraft information form that we're going to get into, but you fill out the weight of the load for that aircraft, and you also fill out what the limit for that aircraft is. And obviously the weight can't be bigger than the limit. It might not be able to be the limit. In the COVID flights where we were flying stuff that was pretty lightweight, we were getting bulked out pretty consistently, and pilots generally could only do about half of their total available payload because of the bulk considerations, the volume considerations. Okay, and no other questions. So then we go ahead and dispatch the pilots once we've figured out the aircraft load sheet. So the paper way to do it is there's a triplicate form. One copy goes with the pilot to give to the person receiving it on the other end. Another copy goes with the pilot to get a signature and bring that signature back. And flight operations keeps a copy. Now, in this day and age of smartphones and texting, you could also do all of that just with pictures by taking flight operations, taking a picture of the form, single form going out with the pilot to the customer, the pilot getting the customer to sign it, and then the pilot taking a picture of the form and texting that back to flight operations so that they have a record that the thing was signed for. So there's different ways to skin the cat on that one. Then flight ops needs to introduce the passenger to the pilot and tell the passengers the details of the pilot. The flight ops may also need to introduce the pilot to whoever he's going to talk to on the other side of the operation at the distant airport. You can direct the pilot to ask the ramp manager for loading assistance if there is a ramp service on the airport. And here's where I was mentioning it before, Dave. In fact, we'll have a whole separate slide on it, so I'll wait to come back to that later. And we talked about returning a copy of the Gold Aircraft load sheet or sending it via picture on a text message on a phone. Now, it's optional if you have a very organized operation that the ramp manager's keeping track of every single pilot that's coming out. And if that's the case, you can give the ramp manager a call on your walkie-talkie and say, hey, pilot Joe Blow is coming out in aircraft N4305 uniform, and he's going to need help loading. Or you can say, we've just been notified that a pilot's coming from another airport. He's going to be landing here in about 30 minutes, and that's his tail number, and be sure to park him next to us. The operations aren't always that organized, so but that's possible. That's an optional thing to go through. A lot of people will put up a whiteboard, which is basically your airlift dispatch log with some flight information on it, like the flight's in the air, the flight's landed, the flight's returning. And that way, if there's public around, people can see what the status of the flight is. It's a way for the DART incident commander to see what the status is without having to look into the actual books themselves. But it is duplicative information, and there's a certain time associated with it. So that's up to the DART to decide if they want to put up a whiteboard for active flights. The alternative is you just let people look at the binders and keep the binders out pretty close where people can see them. And I mentioned you communicate with the other DART airports. So now we only have 13 DARTs in the state, and we have 254 airports in the state. So chances are pretty good you're sending your pilot to an airport that doesn't have a DART. But the flip side of that is a lot of times our DARTs all say, gee, let's all have an exercise on the same day, and gee, let's all fly planes back and forth between our airports. And in that case, all your flights are going to be going to and from DART airports. So it introduces some issues. Like, do I double document things? And the idea there is, no, let's have one DART document a given flight, and let's not have to put it through documentation on both sides. A second thing is let's tell the DART that the flight is coming, that the aircraft is coming. And then when that aircraft lands, let's tell the DART on the other side, hey, your plane just got here. And that way they can check off that their pilot landed safely and they can update their status board. And again, as I say, if you're not working with DARTs on the other side, you don't need to go through this extra step. So here's the slide that Dave Bachhold, I think, first brought the idea up for. How do we really turn around fast? Because a lot of our DART operations have gotten very bogged down in filling out forms. And in a real disaster, you want to be efficient. You want to move the airplanes through quickly. One thing we found in the Santa Barbara flight, the Oregon firefighter airlift, was we had a lot of ramp staff, and we had a lot of pallet jacks and pallets. And we were able to have people out on the ramp with stuff that was bagged and tagged and ready to go. And it was a joint operation between flight ops and ramp staff. So the ramp staff was wheeling this around in a cart, and flight ops was out there with their paperwork. Pilot pulled up and parked, let him go to the bathroom if he needs to. But then, boy, the ramp staff was there to help the pilot load the plane. The pilot actually puts all the stuff in because he knows where the weight has to go in order to meet his weight and balance requirements for the plane. But the flight ops person is acting as the documenter. So, filling out the form. Okay, we just put in this ID number baggage with this weight. And then you're doing a total of the weight to kind of back up for the pilot that, no, we didn't just overload the plane. If the pilot's on the ball, he'll have the ability to do a weight and balance. A lot of pilots, though, have like reference weight and balance where they know if they load certain sectors of their aircraft within certain limits, they're good to go. But at any rate, we find that to be a really efficient way to turn the aircraft around rapidly on the ramp, because that's a very precious resource, is those aircraft. You don't want them sitting on the ground. You want them transporting people. You want them transporting goods. And they found out pretty much the same thing in the Thunder Run exercise up in Canada and Washington and Oregon and Idaho a month ago. The people in Canada had that set up where they had the material out on the ramp, and they were able to fast load their pilots and get them over the border quickly, which itself was really interesting because now you're also having to go through customs, and you have a pilot that's got to make an EAPIS declaration. So that was a complex operation. And a couple fine points here. You've got a couple different documents you have to fill out in flight ops. There's an airlift dispatch log, and that's going to stay at the flight operations desk. And you've got an aircraft load sheet, which is out at the plane. So there's some common information that needs to be shared between those two things. So you want your flight operations staff that's out on the ramp to have a walkie-talkie radio and radio back the information from that sheet. So flight operations can say, this is your flight number, and the staff out on the ramp can say, this is the weight of what we put in that flight log, and can even take a picture of the aircraft load sheet and text it over to flight ops so they can relieve all the inventory out of the shipping log that customer service took. Now, this is kind of complex. Anybody have any questions with anything I've just said here?
Our walkie-talkie is pretty handy, available with the equipment at the DART.
Yeah, they're very handy. I recommend getting FRS, GMRS walkie-talkies. You can get premium ones for maybe $90 a pair. And they have 35-mile advertised line of sight, which can be pretty darn good. And of course, they don't really go 35 miles, but that's way longer than you need to go. It's also good to use them for your DART when nobody's at the airport and you're trying to do that initial mobilization. How do you talk to each other at people's homes if the phones are out and you're not all ham operators? So those are handy tools to have. Now, we did have an exercise where people radioed all that information in, but they didn't have a good practice to acknowledge the transmission. And it turned out they had 2 hours worth of transmissions that weren't heard because it's a noisy environment we operate in. And the person that was supposed to be getting all this information and recording it had no idea it was coming in. So if you use those radios, be sure you get an acknowledgement that the information is received on the other side. Okay, any other questions before we move on?
Just curious, are we allowed to use any aviation frequencies, or are those purely only for air?
Yeah, we have no authorization to use aviation frequencies. And yet on occasion we bend the rules and we use them because we know that we aren't operationally impacting anybody. Don't ask me how I know this, but I do have 600 hours of formation where a lot of times we need to speak between planes and the air. And I've been into Mexico where we have a lot of like medical flights up in the air at the same time. And you can find frequencies that are not in use. Of course, you don't want to impede anybody's use of their frequency, and you can cause problems and you may not know you're causing problems. So I say that with caution. But having said that, you can generally find some frequencies like 5 fingers. Anybody know what 5 fingers is?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yep, exactly. And the ones close to that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, they're always available. And of course, you didn't hear that from me.
Well, I imagine you can always use the air-to-air frequency.
We can. And
What's that,
especially if it's-
122.9 or something?
122.5 maybe.
Yeah.
Not exactly sure. In LA, it tends to be very heavily used and difficult as a result to use operationally. If you're lucky, you'll be out in a remote area where there's not a lot of pilots, and then there's 2 published air-to-air frequencies and a balloon frequency as well. Those are the places to start, certainly.
Is that information on the walkie-talkies available in the material, the types and models?
No, but like if you go to Home Depot, they have walkie-talkies, Motorola, commonly available. And the 35, last time we did a careful investigation of it, 35 mile was the best you could get. They have a high power and a low power setting that with a button you press. So if you really need to go a long ways and not just across the airport, you want to be pressing the high power button. And then we found that not all 35 mile radios were the same. So the one with the best sensitivity that could really go 2 towns away, about 8 miles through the air, it was kind of a nasty radio. It had some background noise to it. And the flip side, the one that had perfect, lack of background noise, it didn't work. It didn't go that really long route. So there can be a little bit of a trade-off between radios. Okay, now the jobs, they said, did I get all this stuff? Yeah, good enough. The job's not done until you complete and retain a copy of the airlift dispatch log and complete the aircraft load sheet and retain a gold copy and notify customer service that the flight is complete. And that, when I say the job's not done, that's for a particular flight. And what do you do if there's no customer service? So it's possible, I mentioned earlier, that there's times where you aren't as fully staffed as you'd like to be. So you might, the flight ops department might do both customer service and flight ops. And so therefore you're doing all the documentation for both departments. Which means if you haven't already read it, go take a look at the customer service training video and make sure you understand how that function works. And Phil Bardara, can you take a look through the chat for me and see if there's any questions in there that I haven't addressed? I know I missed one last week. And
Will
Diane
do.
Gaskill, you have a question. Go ahead.
I have a question about radio frequencies. If there were multiple darts involved in a very large disaster, would each dart have its own frequency, or would we all share one so that everybody can talk to everybody? But it sounds like that would be a really much too busy to do that.
Yeah, we actually we like for all of the darts to be able to connect with each other through a communications desk. And that chokes all the communications that you're doing between the incident commanders and flight ops and pilots down to a single point of communication, which is difficult. But if the cellular networks are out, that may be the only way we can get through. And we actually, just a month ago, had a statewide network test where we invited all the darts to connect from their operations radio desks. And we'll probably, it was good, but it had a lot of problems. So we'll probably do that again within a month or so and do it quarterly or yearly just to keep that capability fresh. There's also radio plans that forms 205, ICS 205, where the darts like to be able to connect via the radio to their local emergency operations centers. And that would be with the cities and the county around the airport. And those will generally have selected amateur radio frequencies in use. As far as in the air and aviation frequencies, we start off just using published aviation frequencies. We don't start off with any dedicated frequencies. Okay. So now at the end of the day, when this is the last operation that the pilot's going to do, we make sure the pilot gets home okay. So we'll have to call their cell phone. Hopefully they call us when they get on the ground or text us and say that they're home safe and sound. If they don't do that, we call them. If they don't answer, we call their emergency contact. If the emergency contact hasn't heard from them and now maybe an hour or two has gone by and they should have checked in somewhere, now we start getting other people involved. So tell the DART incident commander as soon as you have a concern. At some point, you're going to call Leidos Flight Service, 1-800 Weather Brief, and have them, they will initiate a search for the pilot. And they have a protocol that goes out through Civil Air Patrol and eventually through the Army looking for emergency locator beacons. So provide them with the name of the pilot, the aircraft, tail number, as well as flight details. And they'll get it going. And then you can check on status at a different number. This is the number at the Army, the one at the bottom, on how the search is going for that pilot and plane.
There were no questions, Paul.
Yes, sir, Phil.
There were no questions.
Okay, thank you for checking for me. I appreciate it. And by the way, I assume everybody has put their name and email address into the chat. If you haven't already done that, please do that. That's how we were able to take an attendance for the class. Okay, now we're getting into the most interesting part of the whole presentation for the evening, the forms. So there's a bunch of forms, a pilot and aircraft information form. I say that jokingly, of course, and hopefully nobody will fall asleep. There's a pilot certification and waiver that gets filled out. A pilot list, both a local version on paper as well as a web version. We've found we use both forms. An aircraft load sheet, an airlift dispatch log. And of course, we're notifying customer service of flight completion. So there's a couple more forms. They need to update their service request and their service request log. So those are the documents we get involved with. So here's the pilot and aircraft form. Our current versions of these forms have a pretty nice detailed description of every single box on the form, what information needs to go there. And that's helpful because if a year has gone by since you thought about any of this stuff, it helps get your brain around what it is you're trying to collect. And here's what the pilot and aircraft information form looks like. Now, most of it's pretty straightforward, so I'll skip over the stuff that's simple. Assignable cargo and or passenger weight. So this is an area that often gets mixed up. So it's the total useful load of the plane minus the fuel that's on board. And typically the pilot will just do a standard amount of fuel he's going to be working with in that particular plane, which either full tanks or maybe he works with something standard that's less than full tanks. Standard crew on board and any other items that are on board. So that's the assignable weight. Now, it could be that the pilot doesn't really want to go to the maximum. So that's their choice. They can do something less than that number. It shouldn't be anything more than that number. So that gets recorded for each aircraft. And we ask the pilot to fill out the pilot and aircraft information form So they're giving us this information, and that's one good thing to verify with them when they give it to you. Just quiz them, how did you calculate the weight you gave me that I can assign you, and make sure that it's in this definition, because if it's not, you may need to recalculate it. Then aircraft insurance and expiration date, pretty standard stuff. This is personal liability, property damage limits, and that's really aircraft liability. So like a common thing is to have $1 million smooth, or maybe $1 million with 100,000 per seat. Those are two acceptable formats for us, and larger numbers are fine as well, of course. Driver's license number, pilot certificate, the type of pilot certificate, private, commercial, or ATP. Note that we don't take sport pilots. And your ratings, put those down there: aircraft single engine land, aircraft multi-engine land, that sort of thing. Instruments, a very important rating. That gives us a sense of how robust a pilot is. If a pilot's not instrument rated, they can get into a lot more problematic situations, and we need to make sure, well, let's not send them someplace where there's fog, or where there's a storm, or there might be an overcast. We want to help them be safe. And then documentation checked. So if this is done in paper format, and this is a paper version of the document here, we put initials by the person in flight ops that's seen each of these items. You don't want the pilot to initial this. This is for flight ops to initial all these things. And then the pilot puts his printed name, signature, and that sort of thing. Any questions on the pilot and aircraft information form? Marielle, go ahead.
Yeah, can you remind me how long these forms last before they are expired and we have to have them done again?
Generally, we say that if a pilot has registered for a DART operation within the last 12 calendar months, we accept that registration and they don't have to go through it again. After that time, the next operation they participate in, they need to do a fresh pilot intake. And we will accept documentation registration at one DART to be used in another DART. But the first DART should verify that they went through the complete pilot intake process and have all that information on file. That do it, Marielle?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so that's the pilot and aircraft information. You can put your hand down, Marielle. That's the pilot and aircraft information form. So here's the pilots list local. So this is another paper form, pilot's name, intake complete. We say initial that there with the person who initialed it. Reviewed the documentation. Their pilot certificate type, private, instrument, their home airport. Are they instrument? Yes or no? That's a real big one. Cell phone, email address, and number for the plane and manufacturer and model, and load limits. How much weight and how much poundage and passengers. Some people will add an extra column because this form doesn't have it. How many passengers can a pilot take? That's another common limitation. Like I can take maximum 2 people or maximum 3 people. And just because you gave me 4 people and they're under my weight, but I don't have a seat for that 4th person. So it's pretty common to put in a number of passengers maximum as well. Any questions about the pilots list local? Now here's the web form of the same thing. You'll recall that on the paper version of the pilot and aircraft information form, the pilot hands that over to the flight operations desk, and right then and there, the flight operations examines all the pilot's documentation and initials it all. And that's how it gets documented in the person-to-person paper basis. A lot of times we're working on remotely from home, and we ask the pilot to email us their credentials. And so on the web version of this thing, the pilot never sees this. So it's relatively safe. We don't have to worry about the pilot monkeying with any of this information. So when we've seen the pilot certificate for that pilot and verified that they're current on the CalDART membership list, we just put check marks in all these boxes. And when they've got all the boxes complete, their intake is complete. And again, it's common that we'll add a limitation here for how many numbers of passengers they can use. The next version of this form might have that in there. Any questions on the web version of this form? And you'll notice here that there's an instructions tab. So if you forget how to fill out any of those things, the instructions will tell you. So here's the pilot certification, release, and waiver of liability. This is a pretty complex document because on the one hand, it says the pilot agrees not to sue anybody. On the other hand, it says they agree to fly a conforming Part 91 flight. And it asks them for some pretty specific questions about what that means. And it tells them that, hey, you're the pilot in command. You need to make sure that you're responsible for this flight and that you don't fly unless it's safe. So this really lays out a lot of the basic contract of what we expect our pilots to do when they fly. So let's see, any other specific points to mention on this? And again, if you have a question about this, feel free to raise your hand. We mentioned that the loading, the weight, and the balance are all the responsibility of the pilot. So in flight ops and the ramp staff, we're there to be used as a tool of the pilot, as a labor-saving device, but it's the pilot who's responsible for his weight and balance and his loading. And that's why we want the pilot to physically load the plane, because they know where their stuff can go. They know what their envelope is and how to load it up properly. In the airlines, people are trained to do this out on the ramp, and they have a whole group that does that. But each of our planes is different, and it's the pilot that's the expert. None of our ramp staff is expected to be that trained on each of these planes. So the pilot maintains the responsibility for loading the aircraft. A little bit of a photography and videography license. You'll notice we have photos of our planes and operations in our movies and websites and things. So the pilots have agreed here or not agreed to do it. And if they haven't agreed, we need to make sure we scrub all of our records of the day and videography and photography from their plane. So pretty standard boilerplate. Any questions about the pilot certification and waiver of liability? Okay, Diane, go ahead.
It's not exactly that, but I don't remember you saying anything about airworthiness certificates, maintenance, logs being up to date or anything like that on the plane. Is that considered at all?
So excellent point. There are limits as to how intrusive we get with our check, and it's quite difficult to inspect logbooks. If you're in an air show, they're going to want you to take a picture of your page, of your last page that said, this aircraft is certified to be airworthy. We haven't gone to that step. We have tried to be pretty much in alignment with other public benefit flying groups. So people like Angel Flight West, Liga International, there's a whole bunch of groups that get pilots together and fly. And we've tried to more or less be in the center of that realm of practices of how we document our pilots.
Yeah, Paul, also under paragraph 9, it says that the pilot will conduct a flight in conformance with the FARs, which would cover those basic requirements.
Yeah, so the pilot's certifying basically that their maintenance of their plane is proper and that their aircraft is airworthy. Thank you, Peter. Okay. Next up is aircraft load sheet, another very important document. So here's where we write down the flight number that, and the flight number comes from the airlift dispatch log. We'll see that next. And number of the plane, aircraft make and model. So we wrote down what the payload limit is. And down here, we've got a total weight. So that's where the one number shouldn't be bigger than the other number. We've got a fuel on board that the pilot has, and we're checking that against the expected time of the flight. We've got a pilot's name and phone number, a departure airport and arrival airport, estimated departure time, estimated flight time, and that's where the fuel on board becomes significant. Souls on board and form prepared by, and note this spot here for pilot approval. We want the pilot to sign off on this because this has the weight that he just put in his plane, and he's responsible to make sure that his plane has been loaded properly. So he definitely needs to take a look at this document and make sure that he's in agreement with what it says. And now here's where we have the shipping log, the service requisition number. So when we send a copy of this to customer service, they can mark all that stuff as being flown once we say that this flight is complete. Hazmat, we had a big discussion about hazmat and customer service. All of this should basically be saying no, and it helps us to remind us that we don't fly hazmat. So we have our weights and extended weights and total weights. And then at the far end, this is the load received by. So we want the person who takes it at the far end to sign for it. At the bottom, it says white, yellow, and pink copies. Those are triplicate copies if you do it the paper way. The other way is to take pictures with cell phones and do text messages. Now, in a disaster, the cell phone network may be down, so paper, it's good to have a pile of these things at your airport that you can use. A pile of them in triplicate. Here's the airlift dispatch log. For each flight number, it gets a line item. So it's just a summary of the important information from each aircraft load sheet. So there's the weight, there's the assignable weight. So we also address on this log that we hit our limit. The end number, pilot's name, pilot's cell phone, departure and arrival, destination airports, and actual departure time, actual arrival time. Here's where we mark down that the pilot actually got there. Pilot home safe time. So this is where we're documenting that we verified that the pilot got home safely. Very key form, this airlift dispatch log. This is really the heart of our checks and balances to make sure that everybody got home safely. So large airlifts planned ahead of time. Now we're beginning to branch out a little bit. And by the way, I'm not showing the customer service forms. They're available in the customer service video. Here's a couple pointers when you're planning a large airlift ahead of time. So balance the number of planes with the amount of cargo and passengers. That avoids a lot of headache on the day of where you've got a lot of stuff that can't be flown. Or a lot of pilots that want to fly that don't have anything to fly. Consider soliciting FBO participation at your departure hub and destination airports. So the FBO has manpower, it has ramp space, and it may be very useful to get them to help you specifically. We've had some FBOs store material for us for a few days while it was waiting to be flown. We've had them help provide linemen to bring aircraft in and what do they call that? Marshal them into parking. Now a hub airport, we haven't really talked about hub airports before, but if you have a really long flight, and the flight to Oregon was a really long flight, only about half the loads went on nonstop flights to Oregon. Some of them stopped for a gas refill, and some of them stopped halfway to drop their load off and let somebody else fly it the rest of the way. So hub airport is desirable if you've got people that aren't going to fly the whole way. And another good thing is to arrange for some extra planes because there's always people that drop out because the aircraft has a mechanical. There's extra people that show up and suddenly you've got to take stuff that you didn't think you need to take, or maybe you got more volume maxed out in your aircraft than you thought you would, and now you haven't flown all the stuff you thought you'd be able to fly. And it's good if those extra planes know that they're kind of on standby, so they don't get disappointed that, hey, I didn't get to fly. They knew up front that they were a standby plane. So you can prepare an aircraft dispatch log for long flights. And one way to do it is to have aircraft that are totally matched with each other. So if you don't have a hub airport with an FBO that's providing that gracious service, you could have two Cessna 172s split up the flight, and they meet at the airport of the second guy's aircraft, or they meet at a mutually desirable location, and the second guy continues on up. And of course, in these large airlifts, you want to put together information sheets for your participants that they get ahead of time so they know what the overall plan is for the airlift that day. And if you're going to get multiple airports involved, you may get more airports staffed than just the departure airport. So for instance, in the Santa Barbara, Oregon firefighter airlift, we had some small staffing in Oregon, and we had significant staffing at Santa Rosa, the hub airport. And then you can communicate between those airports, providing details of when people took off and that sort of thing. So here's a diagram. I mentioned if you had two 172s, You could start at one airport, meet at a mutually convenient spot, unload plane A, load it into plane B, and because they're the same type, you'll get the load transferred. So it needs to be the same type or larger. But this isn't perfect. We've had, different pilots load their plane different ways, and some people aren't willing to scratch their interior and furniture. And so sometimes you aren't necessarily going to get the exact same load, even though it's the exact same plane. Here's an example of the hub airport. The hub airport is nice because I don't have to match the types. So I just have to have enough planes on each leg of the flight. And I can have a standby plane ready to go at this hub airport, where if something wouldn't fit, or if a plane dropped out, now I bring my standby airplane in, and away they go. And this hub airport provides services. It can have a potty for the pilots. It can have a snack bar. It can have a big area on the ramp to hold all the goods while we're waiting for the second group of pilots to show up. And now we're going to the end. We can ask questions. This is kind of an interesting diagram. We've got a person on a car that's probably pretty rickety. I don't think cars have been invented very long. He's on a high wire, so to speak, balancing while the thing's in motion. That's got to be quite the challenging operation. Not so different from running a DART exercise. Okay, anybody have any questions? Diane, go ahead.
Yeah, we've been talking about cargo all going in one direction from a source to a destination airport. Does CalDART ever set it up so the return flight would not be empty? In other words, I carry cargo A from point A to point B. I pick up a different kind of cargo from point B back to point A. That way I'm not using up fuel for nothing.
Yeah, that's very desirable to do. In the specific airlifts we've done, probably the best example of that is making multiple stops on a flight where we didn't so much have something for the trip back, but we were at least able to take partial loads and drop them at different airports. In a real disaster zone, you're probably going to be flying evacuees one way, and you're going to be flying supplies and disaster workers in the other way. So that might give you a good opportunity to fly in both directions. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to stop the share for just a moment. Let us all smile at each other. Thanks all for showing up. Your questions really help make this a much more rich and worthwhile experience for our subsequent viewers. And I hope you all have fun at your next DART exercises.
Thank you. Good presentation.
Thanks a
Thank you
lot,
so much,
Good
Paul.
night.
Thank you for putting this together. Thanks for all the hard work.